It's the most consumed beverage on the planet other than water. Tea, or chai, is everywhere, from the sachets we make at home to the snacks and desserts sold in grocery stores. We drink tea as a sacred ceremony, enjoy it in high society outings, and rely on it to survive in some of the world's harshest climates. The story of tea is fascinating, from its first use as a source of food through centuries of trial and error, until we ended up with this. Tea would play a part in the spread of religion, trigger the Opium Wars, and even the American Revolution. It's the subject of myths and legends, not to mention countless examples of truth being much wilder than fiction. And so, well, we're diving in, following the unbelievable path of one of history's most fascinating subjects. It's all about tea, today on OTR. In 1857, a young Englishman named Samuel Beeton convinced his wife to help out with the cooking section of his magazine, a new journal focused on issues of the home. Now, at the time, Isabella Beeton was just 22 years old, and so for her column, she enlisted the help of the magazine's readers, asking for input from housewives and family cooks what was the most important thing in their own homes. And after receiving more than 2,000 letters, the answer was clear. It was tea, and there wasn't even a second choice. Over the next few years, Mrs. Beeton would publish dozens of recipes for tea, not just the drink itself, but how it should be served to family members or travelers stopping in off the road. She'd write about the differences between high tea, noon tea, afternoon tea, and tea for picnics. There were articles about winter tea, summer tea, and she even wrote instructions for what to do when your water's not good enough to make tea. You add a pinch of sodium bicarbonate. Now, Isabella Beeton is today regarded as massively influential in the world of tea, but the truth is all she did was record what was already happening, because pretty much everywhere tea is more than just a drink. It's a social centerpiece, something that's a necessity of life, those are Mrs. Beeton's words, and a major part of the human experience. Tea is presented to guests in Morocco, brewed in elegant pots in Russia, and enjoyed as breakfast in Ireland. On Mount Everest, Sherpas start each day with tea for good luck, and in Japan, well, the cha dough brings together the 4 principles of Zen Buddhism. As a planet, we drink more than 5 billion cups of tea every single day. Restaurants across Asia put pitchers of tea, not water, on the table for customers. There's sweet tea, milk tea, yak butter tea, and of course, bubble tea, perhaps the world's fastest growing culinary sensation. Almost every single culture has its own preferences when it comes to tea, but the interesting part isn't how we drink it, but why, and how it arrived in all these different countries in the first place. To trace the story of tea is to dive into a world of corruption and espionage. It's to follow the spread of religion and trade, and also drug smuggling, colonization, and revolution. It's to talk about a commodity as much as a beverage, and to follow the stories of the wild characters who brought it into the mainstream. Nothing about the history of tea is going to be simple or straightforward, but as always, it has to start somewhere. So let's go back to the very beginning and get into the story. There's a legend told in Chinese mythology that a very long time ago, a child would be born half human and half dragon. Almost as soon as he came out of the womb, he was talking, able to walk after just 5 days, and within a year, he was already fully grown and leading a tribe in the rugged highlands. Now, Jiang Shinian was known to be as strong as an ox and 8 feet tall, but what was most significant was that his skin was transparent. So anything he'd eat or drink, well, he could see its effect on the body. And this was important because Jiang was destined to become Shennong, the god of agriculture and the founder of Chinese medicine. Anyway, according to the story, after years of traveling through the countryside, one day, Shennong ate no less than 72 poisonous plants, and together the toxicity was too much even for a god. So he collapsed on the ground, but just at that moment, some leaves fell from a nearby shrub and landed in his boiling pot of water. With his last strength, Shennong filled his cup, took a sip, and found himself restored and completely healed. And from then on, well, he'd have a new title, the God of Tea. Shennong would spread his new favorite herb across China, and it would become ubiquitous after his son Huangdi would unify the empire, creating a powerful tea-drinking society. The story of Shennong and tea is essential in Chinese mythology, And the only problem is that it's a complete misunderstanding. It wasn't supposed to be about tea at all, at least not until much later. Now, before we continue, let me explain something important. For the first 2,000 years of Chinese writing, the word used for tea is a character known as tu, but all that word meant was something bitter or medicinal that was boiled in water. According to archaeology and ethnobotany, if you somehow traveled back in time to ancient Xi'an and asked for a glass of tu, the odds are you'd be handed something made from sow thistle, a relative of the dandelion. There was also tea made with chicory, from Chinese knotweed, from carpenter's herb or brownwort, and from flowers like chrysanthemum, jasmine, and osmanthus. And it's not even incorrect to refer to this as tea because it is in Chinese. But we're not here to talk about herbal tea or flower tea. We're here to talk about this. And if this doesn't actually come from ancient China, well then, what's the real story? Well, for that we need to look 1,000 miles southwest of what was once the Chinese border, to the hills of Xishuangbanna, around an area known as Pu'er. According to botany and archaeology, approximately ground zero for a plant called Camellia sinensis, or tea. Now, on the entire continent, this might be the region we understand the least. It has a long and extremely complicated history and is home to 25 of the 56 recognized ethnic groups in the entire country of China, a nation to which it's belonged since the Mongol conquests. We have no way of knowing which of these groups was the first to domesticate tea. Maybe it happened in more than one place simultaneously. But all we know is that around 2000 BC, all of a sudden tea, or la in local languages, starts showing up all across a swath of the highlands from Myanmar to Assam, India. But it wasn't being used as a drink. It was a source of food. The leaves packed with nutrition and vitamins, polyphenols, antioxidants, fiber, and probiotics. Tea is one of the healthiest plants endemic to that highland region, but it's also incredibly bitter when you eat it raw. And the leaves are so tough and sinewy that they're almost inedible. So why all of a sudden was tea in demand? Well, the breakthrough seems to be when farmers started packing tea leaves into pieces of bamboo and burying it all underground to ferment. This would break down the starch, soften the flavor, and even increase the nutritional content. And we know exactly how important this would become to the local diet because it's still made that way today, a specialty of the rural hill tribes around Pu'er and Xishuangbanna. And of course, it's a national specialty in Myanmar, a place where fermented tea leaves are still a part of almost every single meal. Every day, Namsu Restaurant receives delivery of fermented tea leaves straight from the farm across the border in Myanmar. The region where the tea is grown is called Shan State, along the Yunnan border and where the plant is endemic. But it's not just Shan cuisine that uses tea. It's essential everywhere, and you could make an argument that Laphet Thoke, or tea leaf salad, might be the definitive flavor of Burmese cuisine. So 4,000 years ago, when we first see people eating tea as a part of a traditional diet, they were adding burrata to the top. And no, I'm just kidding. This is a very modern interpretation of one of my all-time favorite things. Tell me real quick, what do we have on the table? We'll get to these two last, but these three tea leaf presentations.
So what we have now is we have 3 different styles of how Burmese tea leaf salads can be actually made. Very versatile. So you have here, starting with the very traditional Burmese tea leaf salad, which we actually explained earlier. Fermented tea leaves, but we added the mix of bean, some vegetables on it, and you have some garlic and a chili on the side and a piece of lime. And the second one, you have our Namsu Shan style or simple or simpler versions of how traditional Burmese tea leaf salad can also be made in a very simple way. And but the difference between traditional tea leaf salad and a Shan tea leaf salad is we don't add any peanuts or crunchy things. Instead, we added Shan sticky corn. So that's the main difference between traditional one and a Shan style. And the last one is we have a very modern, but very comfort food. We call it drinking dish. Pounded mutton tea leaf salad at the bottom. On top, a bit of fancy, we added the burrata cheese on top, and it has to be enjoyed with the samosa skin on the side.
And if this wasn't our first location of the day, I would have a beer with this because it's one of the world's great drinking foods. We talked about this a little bit as they were starting to prepare the food, but I want you to kind of explain to me just how this is not on the menu at Nam Su. This is the classic Laphet Thoke. It is not on the menu here. But when I told you that we were coming and we were going to film about tea, and I asked if it was possible for your cooks to prepare this, most people know how to make this. Yeah. This is a pretty well-known dish across Myanmar. You ask somebody, do you know how to prepare a Laphet Thoke?
I do.
Everybody does.
Everybody does.
Or at least call dad or mom.
I think we were born with this, like how to prepare the tea leaf salad at home. Even like it's even you're a stranger to, let's say, when you visit Burma, and you will be invited by one of the Burmese people, and you will be at their home. And without this, the hospitality of Burmese wouldn't complete it. So I think we were born with this tea leaf salad with a cup of tea on the side.
You know what's so fascinating? You get a different character of the tea. In the traditional Laphet Thoke, it's going to be more sour. In this one, you almost get the sweetness and the brightness of the tea leaves. It's such a great ingredient. I don't know why this isn't something that has, in 10 years, you'll be able to get this at every grocery store. I'm positive. It's such a fun ingredient. It's healthy, it's absolutely delicious, and it doesn't taste like anything else. So to me, it's just, there are these things like the sataw, here in Thailand. There are these things that are just oversights that for whatever reason got missed during the years of everything kind of going back and forth. But that's gonna change, and to me, fermented tea leaves, I like tea as a drink. I love tea as a food. The first evidence of tea in China, the actual tea plant, not just tu, shows up in the tomb of the Han Dynasty Emperor Liu Qi, built around 141 BC. It was presented in the mausoleum as a valuable item, most likely brought back during the raids and invasions the Han had begun of the Yunnan Mountains. Within 30 years of the tomb's construction, Yunnan would be annexed, and the Chinese would begin tea cultivation closer to the capital, in what's now Sichuan province. But at least in the beginning, it was still viewed as a source of food. The reason there's so much confusion about the legend of Shennong is that starting in the 1st century BC, tea would become a popular version of tu, or medicinal herbs, and those herbs were being used in dishes like zhou or congee. Tu was boiled with millet as a popular breakfast, pounded with ginger and shallot and served over rice, and turned into a soup of a whole bunch of stuff mashed together. But again, all we can really do is speculate, until the 7th century AD, when the Tang Dynasty would introduce a new vocabulary, and tea would finally get its own character. It would be a slight adaptation of tu with just a single minor difference. In its pronunciation, cha would most likely be influenced by la, the original word in Yunnan. In the beginning, the new character would represent the tea plant, just one of China's many medicinal herbs. But it wouldn't be long before cha was to become the centerpiece of a new Chinese society. Around the 1st century AD, a splinter branch of Buddhism was taking shape in India. It would be called Mahayana, and it was based around the concept of bodhisattvas, basically delaying enlightenment to help others here on Earth. Now, by that point, traditional Buddhism, or Theravada, had already spread across the subcontinent and throughout Southeast Asia, and there wasn't much interest in this new interpretation. But Mahayana missionaries saw potential in China and began translating their writings into Chinese, starting in the years of the Han Dynasty. When the empire fell in 220 AD and China collapsed into a period of instability, Indian Buddhists built monasteries catering to the poor and the hungry. And scholars of Taoism and the writings of Confucius, well, they began to theorize about how it could all work together: Buddhism and traditional Chinese beliefs and practices. This hybrid religion, a Chinese adaptation of the Buddhist faith, would explode into the mainstream in the 7th century, when the Tang Dynasty brought it to the masses. And perhaps more than any other single event in Chinese history, this almost overnight would change the country's cuisine and diet. In the original teachings of Mahayana Buddhism, to be the best human one can be, no harm should come to any other creature, hence the need to follow a vegan diet. Suddenly, monks and devout followers needed to find a replacement for fish sauce used in almost everything, hence the popularity of a soy-based alternative. With no meat allowed for consumption, well, temples would serve tofu, and monks would invent a new option made from wheat gluten and today called seitan. And it wasn't just animal products that were outlawed. Because of its propensity to cause fights and conflicts, alcohol was forbidden, and this caused quite a problem. See, rice liquor was more than just a drink in early China. It was a way of life, something you'd share with friends and family, and the foundation of social interactions, and with that now on the chopping block, well, something else would need to take its place. And that something, well, it would show up in the unlikeliest of ways. Around the year 740, just as Buddhism was sweeping across China, one monastery in Hubei took in an orphan boy named Lu Yu and allowed him a place to sleep in exchange for helping out with daily tasks. Among his responsibilities was cooking the monk's daily meal, a humble gruel of onions, jujubes, ginger, and tea. Now, I don't know how good or bad this tasted, but we can get a pretty good clue from the fact that this poor starving orphan wouldn't even touch it. In his words, it tasted like ditch water. Anyway, maybe it was because of the food, or maybe Lu Yu was just a rolling stone, but soon enough, he'd flee the monastery and set out on a Tom Sawyer-like adventure, joining a traveling theater troupe and then becoming a circus clown, performing for food or money all across the farthest reaches of the empire. Somewhere, probably around the highlands of Sichuan, he'd encountered tea again, and was shocked to find that when it was prepared by the humblest farmers, made with nothing other than tea boiled in water, well, it was something extraordinary. So entranced was Lu Yu that for the next 30 years, well, he'd devote himself to learning everything he could about the tea plant. In the end, he'd take everything he learned and write a manuscript called the Chajing, or the Classic of Tea. It would describe in 10 chapters everything from the legend of Shennong to the subtleties of tea flavor, to the best way to make the drink at home, in his view grinding the tea leaves into a powder, then stirring it into boiling water. He would also explain why, in his opinion, tea was the consummate drink for Buddhists. It was ascetic and unpretentious. Every step from cultivation to preservation and preparation took time and dedicated focus, and its consumption should be shared among groups of people. In other words, making this a perfect alternative to the evil alcohol. The Classic of Tea would get the attention of not just Buddhist society, but the Chinese emperor, who promoted the work far and wide. Almost overnight, tea shops appeared all across China, and Lu Yu would become known as a god, the god of tea, even while he was still alive. By the way, even now, if you visit a Chinese tea shop, you'll probably find a statue or figurine of Lu Yu on display on the counter. Anyway, within a generation, tea was now right in the middle of Chinese culture. And it wasn't just a beverage, it would become a way of life, inspired by Lu Yu's writing and the new influence of Buddhist philosophy. It would be served as part of a ceremony called jiancha, a deeply spiritual exercise of making, serving, and consuming tea that even now is intrinsic to life in the country. Tea culture would change forever. The drink would enter the national mainstream, and for us, well, finally, we have an excuse for our first cup of tea.
The tea is feel like a culture. You can see anything from tea. Sometimes you drink one cup of tea, you can see like how do people live, how they do, what is the everyday for them. Like when you drink for example, like the Zhengshan Xiuzhong, the smoked one, you can see what they want to make the pine woods, because in that area only the pine woods, something like that. And more than that is people, When I go to there, like the tea plantation, wow, very nice people, very nice ambience, very nice weather, everything is good.
For the last 2 years, ever since opening his first business, Kun Saran has been putting together what might be Bangkok's best collection of rare Chinese teas. For our visit, we've chosen a green tea from a family farm in Sichuan province, and then later we're going to switch to an incredible 20-year-aged pu'er, hand-carried back from the mountains where everything began. But we'll get there later because the whole point of the Chinese tea ceremony is not to rush. This is cool for me. It's been like, I'm gonna have to be careful how much caffeine I'm taking in today because we have a lot of tea to drink. But man, this brings me, I was in China for 12 years. And first of all, the tea itself. So Sanran, who owns this place, was telling us that he just came back from China and he'll go back to go find the best tea and bring it with him here. And so this is all hand carried into Thailand, which is amazing. But also just this culture of not rushing. We've been here now for 45 minutes, and it doesn't feel like it. And we could spend the entire afternoon sitting here just having a conversation. And just it kind of forces you to. You can see how there's that connection to Buddhism in tea. It forces you to relax and to not rush and just to be comfortable to sit here and talk to people for a long time and it's very serene, It's also really good tea.
ป้านจือหนีเนาะซึ่งป้านจือเนี่ยในดินมันจะมีความแบบว่า porosity หรือรูพุนมากกว่าเพราะฉะนั้นมันเป็นป้านที่ไม่ได้ดึงเรื่องกลิ่นมากนักนะฮะเพราะฉะนั้นมันเหมาะสำหรับการชงชาที่บอดี้เยอะๆหน่อยก็เลยเลือกที่เหมาะกับพวกผูแล้วใบนี้ผมก็ชงผูสุกเป็นหลักเนาะใช่แล้วก็ชาผูเนี่ยเป็นชาที่บางทีเราก็ต้องล้างน้ำแรกทิ้งนะครับเพราะว่ามันเป็นชาที่มีความเก่าเนาะแล้วบางทีอาจจะมีฝุ่นมีคราบอะไรเงี้ยเพราะฉะนั้นก็ล้างไปเพื่อความสบายใจได้เนาะแต่อย่างชาเขียวเนี่ยผมจะไม่ล้างเพราะว่าชาเขียวเนี่ยมันทำแบบโปรเซสแบบสะอาดมากนะในปัจจุบันแล้วก็มันชงได้น้อยกว่าชาพวกนี้เยอะพวกนี้บางอาจจะชงได้ประมาณ20กว่าครั้งเลยนะครับ
By the end of the 8th century, just a few years after Lu Yu's book would enter publication, tea would spread east along with Buddhist monks into Korea and Japan. And it wasn't just tea that would quickly become a part of those countries. It was the tea ceremony, in time taking on the characteristic of those other cultures. The Japanese tradition began when a monk named Eisai returned from a trip to China, having learned a new technique of planting with limited access to sunlight. This produced soft leaves that would be grinded raw into a powder, the introduction of what today we call matcha. And given that Eisai would also become the father of Japanese Zen Buddhism, which would heavily influence a group known as the samurai, well, soon enough, the matcha tea ceremony would replace the Chinese one throughout Japanese society. It's called the cha do, or the way of tea, and when done right, it's nearly an all-day event. Starting with a bowl of hot water or kombu and then proceeding to a ritual purification. Guests would then be served a delicate meal of many courses, and only after this would the tea itself begin, in 2 phases, with matcha made into a thick and thin preparation, each one paired not just with foods but with flower arrangements, artwork, and tobacco. Now, while the Japanese cha do would reflect a culture of respect and tradition, the Korean dalya is more about mindfulness and humility. A simple ritual of warming, measuring, brewing, and serving the drink, focusing not on ceremony but on the basic natural gifts of fire, water, and tea leaves. This began as a form of offering, taking root in Buddhist temples of the 8th and 9th century. And as Korea and Japan adapted their own tea customs and began to create their own traditions, well, it stood to reason that eventually the Chinese origins would be cast aside and we see new myths and legends show up about tea. In the Japanese telling, the plant was discovered not by Shennong, but by a Buddhist monk named Bodhidharma, a mythical figure said to be the founder of Shaolin Kung Fu. Anyway, in this story, Bodhidharma spent 7 years sitting in meditation when finally he was overcome with exhaustion and found himself falling asleep. In a last attempt to stay awake to achieve enlightenment, and I'm not going to accompany this with photos, but he sliced off his own eyelids so that his eyes couldn't close, then threw them onto the ground where they sprouted into tea trees. Like magic, the trees grew leaves and the Bodhidharma picked some off and started to chew. Energized from the caffeine, he would finish his meditation, achieve enlightenment, and then introduce the world to tea, planting the first trees himself in Japan. As far as the Korean story would go, well, it begins with the founding of civilization, at least in the local telling. In the beginning, there was a golden bowl that descended from heaven, holding 6 eggs, which would hatch into 6 princes. The firstborn and chief among them was named Suro, and he would go on to be a beloved king and a hero of early Korea. When he was old enough to marry, he'd court a princess from a faraway land, the beautiful Hyo Hwang-ok, and as a dowry, her emperor father would send a boat packed with the greatest bounty of the planet, including the seeds of the tea plant. The century after the introduction of Buddhism to Japan and Korea is viewed as the height of China's soft power, a golden age of progress throughout the region and the so-called Romantic era of tea, when the drink became intertwined with everything from religion to culture to diplomacy. But while this was happening, well, thousands of miles to the west on China's opposite border, well, tea was becoming intertwined with something else, something that would have an even bigger impact on the rest of this story. And this, well, it brings us high into the Himalayas, where for the first time, tea would become a commercial product. In the 11th century AD, the new Chinese Song dynasty was getting nervous about an increase in raids from the north. Tribes of Mongols were invading deeper and deeper on horseback, and without a cavalry of their own, the Chinese military was in danger of being completely overrun. So the Emperor Shennong sent emissaries deep into the Himalayas. Now, this was a time when the mountain kingdoms were thriving, cultural and military powers hidden behind the world's most imposing landscape. The Khasa of what's now western Nepal, the Bumthang of Bhutan, and of course, the mighty Tibetans, who ruled from the holy city of Lhasa. The ambassadors from China spread the word. They needed horses and were willing to trade anything, the finest silks, jade, or gold. But there was only one product coveted by the people of the High Plateau, and so a contract was drawn up in 1074 that every 60 kilos of tea sent from China would be paid for with one single horse. And within a century, 25,000 horses and 1.5 million kilograms of tea were changing hands every year along what we now call the Tea Horse Road. Now, tea was not unfamiliar to the highland people. As far back as the 2nd century AD, we find archaeological evidence of tea in Tibet, boiled and mixed with salt and yak butter, exactly the same way it's consumed today. It was hearty, warming, and revitalizing for the people of the cold and hostile region, and would be a valuable commodity traded between Yunnan and Lhasa. In fact, to this day, there are villages in Yunnan province built as waypoints for the ancient Tibetan tea trade. But with the establishment of the route to Sichuan, tea was now affordable and essential to the high mountain kingdoms, and it very much remains that way to the present. The tea horse road would completely transform the culture of the Himalayas. Yak butter tea would become central to life and hospitality. Monasteries and entire cities would be built along the path leading from China. And just like in Japan and Korea, tea would enter local mythology, with the most common story crediting the plant to Songtsen Gampo, the founder of the Tibetan Empire and the spiritual ancestor of all Dalai Lamas. Now, from a Chinese perspective, the tea horse road was a failure. Even with all the new horses, the Mongols ran roughshod over China, and by 1271, Kublai Khan was sitting on the throne in Beijing. But by that time, Chinese tea served in the Himalayan palaces had caught the attention of the neighboring states, in Central Asia and India. And before long, well, it would become a sought-after commodity. And since this story's about to get rough, well, let's load up on some yak butter tea. In the Himalayan mountains, yak butter tea is a tradition, not just for socialization, but also survival. But this is not the Himalayas, this is downtown Bangkok, and trying to drink here is not exactly the same as if we were freezing at 3,000 meters elevation. But at least the air conditioning's on. For the last 2 years, Bhutan Kitchen has been the country's only venue showcasing the food and drinks of the reclusive kingdom, wedged between China and India. It's a place I know very little about, so as a guide, we've invited our friend Pema, who grew up drinking tea in Bhutan's rural north.
Boiling tea and water right here, yeah. And he gonna pour it in this container,
and he's gonna make the
butter tea. Yeah.
So we're watching him combine it all. Okay. And this butter is already mixed with salt.
No, it's a pure butter, no salt. So then he gonna put salt. Actually, to make the real one, they use chimney, to mix the butter and tea. Yeah. So this is modern style of making butter tea.
As if I have not had enough caffeine from our last stop, let's just chase that with another tea. So in the, to me, I'm fascinated by Himalayan food. In Nepal, there's a lot of Indian influence. In Tibet, there's a lot of Chinese influence. In Bhutan, you get some old school Himalayan food, and that also includes tea. Pema, good friend from Bhutan, where are you from?
Thank you. I'm from Bhutan, but it's a northern part of Bhutan. It's known as Ha. Yeah, I'm from that part of side. So mostly people, they drink little bit different kind of tea around there. Yeah.
This is a little bit more elegant than what you'd find there.
It's more elegant.
In my experience, it's going to be a little bit thicker in the mountains. I've never been to Bhutan, but I have been to the Himalayas before. This looks easy to drink. Sometimes yak butter tea is not so easy to drink for a foreigner.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, because it's like more buttery and the savory.
Salty.
From the salt, salty. So it's the foreigner find it a little bit difficult to drink it. Yeah.
Try this one.
I should try this before we continue talking.
Then give it to me to try.
Oh, but the flavor. No, it's quite savory. It tastes like melted butter, tea, and salt. Share tea. What's this?
It's known as zao. It's zao, Z-A-W zao. So it's mainly made from rice. They cook the rice first, and then they will like fry and make it like this. It's like a snack in Bhutan. Yeah.
And you eat this with
Yeah,
tea, or?
you eat it just. You can eat it like this.
Yep.
Yeah, directly. Yeah.
Thank you.
And go some with your tea.
I like it.
But mostly in Bhutan, we just put it inside our own tea. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Tea, yeah, cup like that. So if you soak for a little bit, it will become what do you call soft? Yeah, it will become a little bit soft.
All right, now when the Chinese traders were crossing the Himalayas on the tea horse road, well, what they were bringing in their heavy packs was tea made into cakes, producing an intense and not subtle tea like what we just tried. Those cakes, and by extension tea, were barely recognizable compared to what we all know today. They were made by putting tea leaves through a cycle of steaming and drying and then compressing everything into a dense brick of up to 2.5 kilos in weight. But as tea grew in importance and became a part of Song dynasty social structure, we see the emergence of different tastes. Farmers and producers started perfecting new methods, and by the time the Ming dynasty banned brick tea completely, well, a whole new category had taken shape. The first step in the tea-making process is harvesting the leaves from the tea plant. After that, well, the methods diverge, and by the 14th century, we see a few main styles of tea gain popularity, and it would be these variations that soon enough would conquer the world. Now, the primary difference would involve oxidation. See, just like stuff like apples and avocados, as soon as tea leaves are plucked from the tree, well, they start to brown, and their chemical composition changes. When tea leaves were harvested, then allowed to fully oxidize before drying, well, the result would be what we refer to as black tea, in Chinese Hongcha or red tea. This would have the richest profile in tannins and the strongest and most pungent flavor, which is why over the years it would become the base for big foreign flavors, standing up to ingredients like condensed milk, sugar, spices, and even fruit preserves. It's black tea that's today used in bubble tea, Indian masala chai, and Malaysian tea tarik. When tea leaves would oxidize partially and then be cooked to dry out before becoming completely dark, well, that would be called oolong, named for Wulong, or the mythical black dragon, allegedly inspired by how the tea leaves look when ideally processed. This is the most painstaking tea to make, involving cycles of rolling, drying, and roasting to develop the best flavor, and until the 19th century, well, it was only meant for royalty, the tea of the Forbidden City. If tea leaves are harvested, withered, and then immediately cooked before oxidation, well, that results in green tea. In Japanese culture, it's cooked by steaming, presenting the brightest green color. Chinese green tea is made by pan-firing, which develops a smoother flavor. Regardless, green tea is the healthiest of the tea varietals, preserves the most polyphenols and antioxidants, and it also has the freshest and most vegetal flavor, hence its use in the food world in stuff like ice creams. White tea involves no processing at all. It's just tea. Usually the youngest and softest leaves picked and then allowed to sun or air dry naturally. It's called white tea because without any steaming or baking, the leaves retain their fine white hairs. The most exclusive variety of white tea is made without leaves at all, just the unopened buds of the tea plant. This is what's called silver needle. And finally, there's pu'er tea, named for the region where tea first began, and just like the original teas of Yunnan, it's fermented, aged for as long as 50 years before being made into a drink, not a salad like the old days. The Ming Dynasty policy banning low-quality cake tea would give rise to the variations that would one day become famous around the world, but it would also have another unintentional effect. With the country all of a sudden shifting to consuming loose-leaf tea, well, new equipment would be needed to make it at home. In the past, all you'd do would be break off a part of a tea brick, grind it into a powder, and then stir it into boiling water. But now, well, with customers falling in love with the delicate flavors of their favorite styles, every household would need a dedicated teapot to steep the leaves. Over time, this teapot and eventually entire tea sets would become fashionable items, collection pieces and works of art, giving us the priceless category of what we now call Ming Dynasty pottery. Anyway, let's get back to the story. As the world entered a new era of trade and exploration, while tea was only cultivated in 4 countries. In Myanmar, it was still viewed as a source of food and typically pickled and fermented, not a product seen by Europeans as having any value. That left just China, Japan, and Korea, but by the start of the 1600s, the Tokugawa shogunate and the Joseon dynasty would shut down trade in 2 of those 3 countries, which meant that China was the only nation on Earth to offer high-quality tea on the export market. But that doesn't mean there were any buyers. The first reference by any European to the product was from Giovanni Ramusio, who in 1555 mentions a drink called chai katai, though we only heard of it secondhand from a Persian merchant who had visited China. The Portuguese write of cha after colonizing Macau, but didn't seem to find appeal in what they described as simply water boiled with some kind of herb. And maybe the funniest encounter came when a Russian diplomat was presented with 100 kilograms of tea as a gift for Tsar Mikhail I. But the diplomat couldn't understand why anybody needed so many dead leaves and rejected the gift. It wasn't until the year 1610 when we see any record of foreigners actually tasting the stuff, a manifest of a Dutch trading boat that picked up a single package of Japanese tea in Macau, transited through Java, and finally delivered it to Amsterdam, giving Europe its first ever taste of tea. For the next half-century, the only Western buyers of tea would be the Portuguese from Macau and the Dutch from mainland China, who bought shipments of it not because they wanted the stuff, but because they found a huge market for these, and sold tea as a novelty alongside Ming Dynasty ceramics. As for the Portuguese, well, the tea they bought in Macau was so expensive that it would only be served in the royal palace, not as a consumer good. And in the 50 years the Dutch controlled the Chinese tea trade, well, they would do nothing to actually push the product, and their only lasting legacy would be the name tea. Now, contrary to popular belief, this was not a Dutch invention or some Western misunderstanding. In the past, all of the tea China had ever sold had been delivered by land, or by northern ports in the Mandarin-speaking part of the country. This is why across Eastern Asia, the Himalayas, and Mongolia, the drink would take the name cha, or some variation like ja or chai. But the Dutch were the first to buy their tea from Hokkien traders along the southern coast, and in the dialect of Fujian, well, the exact same character is pronounced te. It's the same exact word from the same exact country, just essentially spoken with a different accent. And for the rest of time, the name of the plant would be connected entirely to whether it first arrived by land or water. If it would be introduced by the Dutch, English, or Hokkien traders, it's tea. If it came overland from China or was sold via Japan, Korea, or Portugal, it would be cha or chai. Of course, there is one country that's an exception to this rule, the only country on Earth to which this doesn't apply. And of course, that's Myanmar, where it's called Laphet, descended from La, the original 6,000-year-old name for tea that's still used in the Yunnan Mountains. Anyway, whatever the name, this plant was about to explode onto the global scene. And when it did, well, it would leave a trail of destruction that would change the course of history. The first record of tea in England comes in 1657, when a man named Thomas Garway bought a few kilos from a Dutch trader and started selling from his house on London's Exchange Alley. He'd bring this new product to a coffee shop he'd opened that same year, and thus tea was officially introduced to the English population. But what would truly bring it to the mainstream was 5 years later, when King Charles II was set to marry the daughter of the King of Portugal. For For the wedding, the new queen requested that her favorite drink be served to all the guests, and that of course was tea, well known as we mentioned in the Portuguese royal palace. Anyway, once on the throne, Catherine of Braganza would not just popularize tea among English nobles, but she even instituted a daily tea time, a practice that remains essential almost 400 years later. Now, in the beginning, Catherine's tea had to be purchased from the Dutch, as they were the only ones sending this stuff to Europe. But Catherine and Charles would quickly sign a contract granting the East India Company a monopoly on tea exports to English holdings, and things would go sideways. In 1664, just 2 years after the wedding, the first British shipment would arrive in London of 100 pounds of tea. 2 decades later, demand had increased to 12,000 pounds, and by the end of the century, tea was being sold along with sugar. See our last video for that story. But basically, this was England's new favorite drink. Tea lightly sweetened and served with those pastries and snacks that were just beginning to enter the culinary landscape. And altogether, well, by 1750, it was now 5 million pounds of tea each year coming in from China. Now, because the East India Company had a monopoly, their profits would skyrocket, but without competition, they'd charge a fortune for the product. Customers were unhappy, tea shops were losing money, and this created an opening for smugglers to undercut the official price. In the 18th century, tea smuggling to England was quite an enterprise. Buyers would purchase cheap tea from the Dutch in Java, deliver it to meeting points off the English coast where the tea would then be transferred onto fishing boats, then repacked inside everything from loaves of bread to Bibles. And it would be this smuggled tea that would soon come to dominate the English market. Now, for the East India Company, this would create 2 big problems. First, they lost a major source of revenue, and second, well, nobody wanted to buy their overpriced tea. So with a massive surplus and profits falling, the company asked the Crown for the exclusive rights to sell to the colonies in America, who had previously bought tea from the Dutch. And to recover some of their losses, they added in a sales tax of 3 pence per pound. A tax, by the way, on a population who had no representation in British Parliament. This did not go over well, and so on December 16, 1773, a few hundred colonists disguised themselves as Native Americans, snuck onto East India Company ships docked in Boston Harbor, and threw an estimated 92,000 pounds of tea into the water, $1.7 million worth of product in today's money. The event would come to be known as the Boston Tea Party, and to this day, well, every single kid who grows up in America learns about this as the trigger for the War of Independence. Anyway, let's take a break for some afternoon tea. All right, I don't think we're supposed to cheers in proper
With your pinky out?
proper tea house culture. Pinky out.
My fingers are too fat for those cups.
It's probably an urban legend, but there's a story that around 1840, Anna Russell, the Duchess of Bedford, found herself becoming faint in the mid-afternoon, because in the old days, well, dinner wasn't served until late. So she started snacking, washing down some cakes and scones with a cup of tea. Soon enough, she started dispatching her guards to deliver notes around London, inviting other high society women to join her for some secret afternoon indulging. Soon enough, this would spread throughout the upper class, and thus was born tea time. If you're not raised in the culture, it can be a little bit confusing. I remember as a kid, the first time I ever was taken out for something like this, I remember thinking, why can't I just have a big sandwich? Why do I get a small sandwich?
Why is everybody 70-year-old around?
And why is it so expensive? I don't know that I thought that as a small child, but I'm pretty sure that's what my parents were thinking. We have sandwiches.
Scones?
Scones, which was also very confusing to me as a small child.
Because it's just
It's just
brick
scone.
of bread.
I'm not trying to I'm not trying to be overly critical here, but as I have grown up, it's nice, and we're sitting out here in this beautiful garden. Yeah.
British food.
Pretending. This is when we cut the audio.
It reminds me, remember this TikTok that like, this is good, but nothing beats the ham and biscuit brickle with beans my mom makes.
In the aftermath of the American Revolution, with no other customers and tons of excess tea on hand, the English Parliament had no choice but to cut taxes. And by 1784, the price of tea had fallen so low that smuggling was put out of business, and the East India Company regained its monopoly on territory still belonging to the Crown. But there was a new problem, which was how to pay for all that tea. See, ever since the Ming Dynasty had given up on paper currency, China's economy depended on silver, and silver was the only payment accepted for tea, or for that matter, silk or porcelain or anything else the Chinese sent abroad. But the British got most of their silver from the New World, and with the American colony now lost, well, this created a massive problem. English merchants tried to find anything else the Chinese would be willing to barter for, but this was rejected. And as demand for tea increased, well, so too did the trade imbalance, and the United Kingdom was running out of silver. So the East India Company decided to bypass official channels and get into the smuggling business themselves. They sent scouts into China to find tea growers or sellers willing to play ball, and in exchange, well, they would deliver them loads of opium, grown in colonial India. The tea for opium trade would be a massive boon to England, and since poppies were essentially free, cultivated by forced Indian labor, well, the trade imbalance was reversed. Money started pouring in, and with as much as 10% of the Chinese population now addicted to the drug, well, the good times were rolling back in Victorian England. But the Chinese government did not appreciate this turn of events, and so in 1839, the Qing Emperor sent a battalion south to create a maritime blockade. They raided British ships arriving in Guangzhou harbor and confiscated more than 1,400 tons of opium, and then they destroyed it all in public to show that they meant business. Now, until this point, the opium trade had been unofficial, but in response to the situation, the Crown sent the Royal Navy to southern China, where for 3 years the British decimated the Chinese military. And finally, in 1842, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, giving full immunity to all British on Chinese soil, accepting new non-silver-based terms for trade and, just for fun, granting England the rights to Hong Kong Island. So thanks to the Opium War, England had its tea. But there was still one major problem, which was that the Chinese hated the British. And it was obvious to just about everyone that this would not be a permanent solution. The only way to actually control both price and supply would be to grow the tea themselves, instead of depending on a foreign country for export. Now, on one hand, this didn't seem crazy. Just a few years earlier, a Scottish arms dealer and mercenary soldier named Robert Bruce, because history is ridiculous, so of course that's his name. Anyway, he'd been wandering through the mountains of Assam, India, when he noticed tea growing wild. As a matter of fact, even though he didn't realize it, this tea had been there for thousands of years, just across the border from Myanmar and Yunnan, and related to the first plants ever cultivated. It was clear seeing the tea growing that this was the right kind of climate to build a large-scale plantation, but what the British didn't know was how to turn this into this. In fact, nobody knew, as the Chinese had kept their cultivation a secret for more than 1,000 years. Only Japan and Korea were also in on it, but again, both were closed to the outside world. Getting answers was going to take desperate measures, and that brings us to the most audacious and unlikely spy in agricultural history. For the first 31 years of Robert Fortune's life, well, nothing much happened of great excitement. He'd grown up in a village in southeast Scotland, and with an interest in plants and botany, he'd worked as a caretaker for a wealthy family, then for the Edinburgh Botanical Gardens. But in 1844, with the Opium War over and England now permitted access to China, well, Mr. Fortune received a letter offering him a 3-year mission to sail to Hong Kong, cross into the mainland, and collect samples of exotic plants for the royal palace. But this trip would not go as intended. In the aftermath of the war, tensions were high, and even though he was just a horticulturalist, Fortune found himself attacked by soldiers, kidnapped by gangsters, and constantly under suspicion, so he trained himself to blend in. He taught himself Mandarin, began to dress in Chinese clothing, and returned in 1847 as something of a hero, publishing his memoirs to great local fanfare. Among those who read the book were executives with the East India Company who realized this might be the answer to their Assam dilemma. So they offered Fortune, well, a fortune, to go back to China undercover and steal for them the secrets of tea. And that's exactly what he would do. Along with his assistant Wang, beginning in 1848, a disguised Fortune traveled across China's forbidden interior, visiting tea plantations in Fujian, Zhejiang, and Sichuan, posing as a Chinese dignitary from a far-off province. And 3 years later, he'd get off a boat in Calcutta bringing seeds, trimmings, and the knowledge of exactly how to make the world's best tea. Now, this was not all that Fortune stole from China. While he'd been in the country, he'd learned that for the export market, the Chinese had a secret, which was that they were adding small amounts of both gypsum and cyanide to preserve the green color that brought in the highest price. In other words, Chinese tea was actually poison. Mr. Fortune managed to bring proof of these chemicals back to London, where they were displayed with great prominence at the first ever World's Fair. And suddenly, not only did England have a domestic source of tea, but China was disgraced. And all at once, no one anywhere wanted anything to do with Chinese tea. And this meant Indian tea production would need to scale up, and fast. All right, now before the British arrived, tea was not unknown in India. The mountains where those ancient tea plants grew, well, that was the home to the Singpo tribe, related to Yunnan's Jingpo and Myanmar's Kachin. And just like those other groups, the Singpo utilized tea by fermenting in bamboo and consuming it as a food. And since at least the 12th century, tea was brewed as a drink in royal houses, introduced by way of Tibet along the Silk Road. This is, of course, why it's known as chai and not tea. But that was imported, and other than the hills of the Singpo, well, tea was never farmed in India until the 19th century. But that would change quickly. In just the first 6 years after the introduction of Chinese technology, 750,000 workers would be conscripted for the new plantations in Assam, Darjeeling, and Tamil Nadu in the coastal south. Now, these workers were what's called indentured servants, not slaves. That practice by now was technically outlawed, but it was close enough. Each worker would sign up for a 5 to 7 year term in exchange for money, along with room and board. But fine print usually said that room and board would be deducted from pay, and that left close to nothing. Anyway, between the new tea plantations, the rush to cultivate sugar, and the other British abuses, in 1857 Indian workers rose up in rebellion. 6,000 colonists were killed, mostly women and children. The British responded by annihilating Delhi and Lucknow, massacring 800,000 Indians, and in the aftermath, annexing India into the empire as an official colony. By 1871, there were 300 Indian tea plantations producing 5,000 tons of the product, a number that would increase to 35,000 tons by 1885, and in 1900 it was astronomically higher. 70,000 tons exported to the United Kingdom alone, and countless more to buyers around the world. And it wasn't just India. In 1867, a blight wiped out the coffee industry in Sri Lanka. So a man named James Taylor, no, not that one, decided to try introducing tea. In the beginning, his operation was small until he'd take on investment from a Glaswegian playboy and amateur yachtsman named Thomas Lipton. Yes, that one. And soon enough, Ceylon teas were everywhere. With the financial success of the colonial plantations, the British would begin planting tea across the rest of the Crown holdings, starting in East Africa with Malawi, then Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. Before long, other European colonial powers got in on the action as well. The French establishing farms in Vietnam starting in the 1880s, and the Dutch forcing thousands of Indonesians to grow tea across West Java. But it wasn't just Europeans exponentially growing the tea trade. In 1868, the Japanese began to reopen to the outside world, and the Meiji government would finance the country's revival through tea exports, mostly to Southeast Asia and the United States. And within a few years of the cyanide fiasco, the Chinese had rehabilitated their own image and were not only back in the tea trade, but carrying tea from China to the West became a sport, a literal competition with prizes granted to whoever built the fastest boats. The tea racing ships would be called clippers, and this would be as popular for fans and gamblers as any modern pastime, although sadly it would end in 1869 with the opening of the Suez Canal. Today, the main legacy of the tea clippers is a whiskey named Cutty Sark, after the greatest tea ship of them all. Anyway, by the dawn of the 20th century, much of the world was now drinking tea. But ironically enough, one country that wasn't was India. The bitter black tea grown in Assam and Darjeeling never quite suited the local palate, and so the English wanted to find a way to grow their customer base. They tried pushing an ad campaign directed at factory workers, telling them that if their workers took tea breaks, well, they'd have more energy and thus would be more productive. Then around the 1930s, someone had the idea to combine this black tea with a traditional Indian herbal beverage, and thus was born Masala Chai, which would eventually lead directly to sweet milk teas like tea Tariq, another global favorite, and since we're due for a break anyway, well, this feels like an excuse for us to swing by one of our favorite Bangkok tea shops.
I remember the first time that Daria and I came into this restaurant. So this was in one of our first ones we ever filmed. We filmed here back in, right when we started the channel, I think video number like 4 or 5 ever. We came here to film this. We've come back, gosh, we were here, History of Curry we taped here. It's been a few, we've come to this restaurant, but it's always just because of this. The balance of the spices, the sweetness, and the black tea is just, and again, even here in Bangkok, like you have this on the streets in India and it costs pennies. And here it's not much more. When we first started coming here, this was 10 baht on the menu, which is like 25, 30 cents. They've raised it, it's about 40 cents now. But man, I am gonna crash so hard.
In the early 1800s, as England was fighting wars over tea, well, the biggest issue back home wasn't supply, it was the quality of the water. See, it didn't matter how good the tea might have been, it all tasted awful when steeped in the dirty runoff of the River Thames. So one nobleman, a Lord Charles of Northumberland, began to ask his cooks to soften his tea with the dried peel of bergamot oranges. As he was the powerful Earl of Grey, well, this would soon reach the general public. As tea spread across the world in the 19th century, well, we very quickly see the emergence of much of what we now know today. Moroccan mint tea got its start completely by accident when a British clipper in the 1850s was headed to the Baltics but got caught in the crossfire of the Crimean War. So the boat turned around, limped into port at Mogador, and unloaded the cargo. Then some enterprising vendors brewed it up with mint and sugar, and since then, well, it's been a North African essential. Turkish tea would show up much later, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. With coffee suddenly unavailable, the new government encouraged tea farming and began cultivation in the province of Rize. So important would this new crop become that multiple Black Sea cities changed their names to reflect the chai industry, and today Turkey is the world's largest per capita tea drinking country. In Russia, well, the first shipment of tea might have been rejected by the Tsar's ambassador, but soon enough that mistake would be corrected, and by the years of Catherine the Great, tons of Chinese tea was being sent overland by caravan. Its spread to the general public would begin in the 19th century, in part thanks to writers like Pushkin and Dostoevsky, the latter writing in 1864 that if he had to choose between saving the world and having a cup of tea, well, he wouldn't skip his daily fix. A number of tea innovations show up in the United States, starting in 1843 when a British immigrant to New York started marketing something he called English breakfast, which would be exported to England and become a favorite of Queen Victoria. The classic American sweet tea shows up near Charleston, South Carolina, the home of the only large-scale tea plantation in the US. There, it was first served in 1890 at a 25-year reunion of Civil War Confederate veterans. 14 years later, iced tea would be introduced to the world at the St. Louis World's Fair, when a sudden heat wave meant that 20 million visitors were stuck in scorching temperatures, so a vendor at the East Indies Pavilion bought a few blocks of ice, poured his tea on top of it, and a new sensation was born. And perhaps the greatest American tea innovation appears in 1901, when two women from Milwaukee patented the world's first tea bags, catching on widely after World War II when everyone was in motion and wanted something fast and easy. And the years after the war also brings us more breakthroughs. In the 1950s, with Malaysia's post-colonial economy struggling, vendors came up with a method to utilize the scraps and cheapest leftovers of the tea plant. They'd mix the bitter tea dust with water and condensed milk and then pour it back and forth to combine everything and mellow out the flavor. Today, tea tarik, or pulled tea, is essential on the Malay Peninsula. The Thai variation, Chayan or Thai iced tea, dates back to the late 1940s, the invention claimed by a Chinese immigrant family who would call their brand Chatramue, or Thai tea No. 1. This wouldn't truly gain popularity until a government initiative convinced opium farmers in the Golden Triangle to switch to tea cultivation and prices went down. You might think that matcha ice cream is a brand new thing, but that actually dates as far back as the 19th century, when Japanese royal banquets added tea powder into shaved ice. This would be turned into soft serve in Tokyo in 1958 and then brought into the global mainstream by Häagen-Dazs, launching in 1996. And then, of course, there's bubble tea, which is now ubiquitous in just about every major city. This got its start in Taiwan in 1986, and since then, the combination of sweet milk tea with pearls of tapioca has been a rocket ship to the big time. As for who specifically gets the credit, well, there are two tea shops that say it was their invention. They both have long and convoluted origin stories, and they both spent decades in court fighting each other. But finally, in 2019, the judge threw out the lawsuit because since there were no patents involved, well, credit didn't matter. Officially, bubble tea now belonged to the world. And because of its success, along with our passion for anything tea-related, well, our production keeps increasing year over year, in 2023 reaching 6.7 million metric tons sold on the global market, and it's not slowing down. Today we use tea in skincare products, as air fresheners and included in everything from Kit Kat bars to soft drinks, Starbucks chai lattes, and Chinese tea-boiled eggs. We add tea to cat litter, and use tea bags as whatever this is, but most of all, we just love the classic. Across the planet, we consume 5 billion cups of tea per day, and 1,250 years after Lu Yu told us to keep it simple, well, we're still following his advice, and we haven't yet managed to improve on the original, although that is up for argument. Tea has become so intrinsic in our lives that it's become part of our language. If we don't like something, we say it's not our cup of tea. To share gossip is to spill the tea, and much ado about nothing is a storm in a teacup or a tempest in a teapot. We drink tea with breakfast when we wake up in the morning, take breaks for tea in the middle of the afternoon, and enjoy it with shisha late into the evening. But whether we drink it at sunrise or sunset, whether we prefer it green or black or Earl Grey, if we add milk or sugar or like ours hot or cold, if we call it tea or cha or laphet, the one thing we can all agree is that this story has gone on long enough. But at least after all this talking, well, you know what's supposed to be good for your speaking voice. Subscribe to the channel for more from OTR. Thank you so much to everyone who supports us on Patreon. It really helps to keep us going. Find links below to our Patreon and social media, and we will see you soon.
This is the first time that you and I have ever had a high tea together.
It's my first time ever.
It's probably this. I think I went to the Plaza Hotel when I was a little kid after Home Alone 2 when everybody wanted to do it. And I didn't understand it. This is a very, if you're not raised in this culture, this was very confusing, I remember, to me as a child.
No, I never had high tea. I only had tea as a tea bag that you use 20 times in my household. There's nothing high about it.
All right, what do we have? So again, if you grow up in this culture, I wish Mary was here. You know, Mary, who's helped us out with the channel in the past. She's part Thai, but she is just so British. She could maybe explain why this is a thing.
She would do British accent. British.
Yeah, I'm not even gonna try.
It's Tuesday, mate. No, it was Australian.
That was Australian at the end.